I spent over 15 years incarcerated in California's Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. In that time, I noticed a paradox that I'm sure is inherent in most correctional environments, but which stood out to me. You see, the vast majority of inmates are always going to be men. And this makes sense. They commit the most violent crimes and they receive the longest prison sentences. But that minority of female inmates, and it can be as little as a quarter of the inmate population, tends to have a slightly higher quality of life. They tend to have more money spent on them per capita, and even disregarding the dollars spent, they tend to have a slightly higher access to things that men generally wouldn't. An example of this is the women's access to something referred to as pruno making materials. This is, of course, sugar and grape juice and things which you could toss in a bucket and make alcohol. But it's some things that are more subtle that you wouldn't immediately think about, like lifesavers or salsa or any type of hard candy that could be broken down for sugar and fruit. Women are traditionally allowed access to these materials to the point that quarterly package catalogs where inmates order their goods have a section set aside called women's food where these items are available. Men are not allowed access to these items because they could use them to make alcohol, get drunk, make bad decisions, and potentially hurt or kill somebody. I personally saw a riot kick off that I can just say factually would not have happened if the guy hadn't been drinking and making bad choices. I'm sure that women make bad choices whenever they drink too, but the effects are less far reaching and the administration puts less effort into preventing them from doing so. An area that is less quantifiable regarding the difference between how men and women are treated while incarcerated is their food. You see, I was able to speak to inmates who were there whenever Chowchilla prison flipped from being a women only prison to a man only prison in California. They said that in the interim time period, as they were moving men in and women out, the food was incredible. That all the slop meals that generally inmates don't want to eat had been so good that they were looking forward to dinner. The slop meals are chili con carne or chicken a la king. It's basically any watery sauce that had a protein in it, and you can just keep adding water or cream or whatever until it's watered down enough that you can pour it over some rice or some potatoes and call it a meal, even though there was very little meat left in it. Well, these slop meals, whenever the women were being fed, there was actually chicken in the chicken a la king, and the chili con carne had chili for the cons. And then the last bus of women left, and it went back to the fare that they were used to. The menu said the same thing. They couldn't point at any one thing that was different, but it was back to being normal prison food instead of nice, decent, meaty food. Whenever they transitioned Chowchilla from being a prison that incarcerated women to a prison that incarcerated men, they were looking for staff to oversee the operation. One of the staff members that they spoke to was the sergeant that I worked for whenever I was incarcerated at SADF. Her name was Sergeant Armour. She was a career Marine, a hard woman. She'd retired out of the Marines, started working for CDC just for something to do for the next 20 years, was the way she described it. She was offered a position overseeing some aspects of the transition, and she spoke to me about the tour that she had taken of the facility, Chowchilla. She elected to not move there and work there because she just didn't want to move one final time. But it was interesting talking to her about some of her security concerns. They were, after all, moving women out and men in. And some things you can't change. The fences are where they are, the guard towers are where they are. She had pointed out that there were a number of large concrete tables with adjustable parasols spread over a very large yard in Chowchilla. Well, that might be nice for women, But in the event that the men were to riot and take over the facility, those would serve to block lines of sight and possibly lines of fire, and that if the administration had any common sense, they would take those out. As it turned out, years later, at the very end of my prison term, I was transferred to Chowchilla, and I paroled from there. I got to see those big concrete picnic tables with the adjustable parasols right where she'd said they'd been. The administration had elected to keep them on the yard rather than mar the beauty of the facility by taking them out. They hadn't been used for anything sinister in 4 years, as far as I knew, and hopefully never will. I was only there in Chowchilla for just a couple of months before I paroled, and I was mostly concerned with not getting into any trouble, not messing things up in that last couple of months before I came home. But one thing that I did take the opportunity to do was to go into the educational area where they had their college program and talk to some of the administrators that had overseen the program. I was curious how the college program had worked under the administration whenever women were being taught. The lead guy there took the opportunity to talk with me for a little while, and he described the job satisfaction that he had received teaching women there in the college program. He said that many of them had paroled and finished their degrees and used the skills that he'd helped teach them to take care of their families and make themselves and their communities better. He expressed he didn't have that same type of job satisfaction yet working with men. They seemed surly and unthankful for the help that they were receiving. I was commiserative that he didn't have the same job satisfaction that he used to. Mostly, I was just overjoyed at the idea that there were guys like this and programs like this available for the female inmates there in Chowchilla. You see, my aunt had been incarcerated at the same time that I was. And while she hadn't been there at Chowchilla Prison, she had been at a prison here in California, and it was reasonable to assume that she'd had that same level of care, that people had tried that hard to make sure that she could get her education and better herself while incarcerated. She did get out. She was a success story. She got out and finished her associate's degree and unfortunately passed on before I paroled, so I was never able to tell her this story of meeting a college administrator and thinking that he might be just like one of the ones that she had worked under. If there's been even a moment that it sounded like I had some sour grapes or envy that the women are treated better than the men in some aspects of CDCR, I want to note how grateful I was that she'd had that and that the other women who go through the California Department of Corrections have been afforded similar opportunities. In your everyday life, if you have that moment where you see somebody that has something that you deserve, I don't mean that you're jealous and you want to take it from them. I just mean that it's a good thing and you deserve it too. Take that moment and try to be grateful and happy that they have it, and hope that they really appreciate it the way that you will when you have it too. Thank you for listening today.